So, now that you understand the basics of creating markers and you've practiced it a little bit in your daily life, it's important to learn more specifically how you should work with them. In the previous demonstration on the Garden City movement, we didn't discuss much about how you should actually link your markers together. We've since explained that you should be able to describe the ways that they're connected using logical markers, creating a distinct relationship between them, and also that you should be able to play them back like a film strip. But let's take it a bit further. As we've learned, creating relationships and dense linkages between data points is going to make them more memorable to the hippocampi. And so it's important that we really learn how we can link our markers together more completely for long-term storage. As we mentioned earlier, markers and their sub-marker details usually come in chunks, whether by paragraphs in a piece of text or by the logic that connects them together. This means that sometimes you might not chunk the details in order. For example, if a topic is discussed at length, you may take the final detail, which answers the question, and chunk it together with some of the information given at the outset of the page or chapter. Now that you've practiced chunking, you'll be able to easily see how you can group markers together by different possible logical chunks. Let's illustrate this with a particularly tricky example, the grocery store. Suppose you need to go to the local store and buy 20 random items. By now, you know well enough that you need to create 20 markers, one for each of these important items. But how do you link those items together to ensure that none of them are that single unconnected memory that drifts off into the sea of your mind? Well, if you're lucky, they're all going to be used into one meal, and you can chunk them either by the side dish or the entree that they'll be used in. But for the sake of demonstration, let's say that you're not lucky. Let's imagine that they're just items you need to buy for your weekly shopping, and none of them have any immediate logical relation to any of the others. Later on in the course, when we talk about memory palaces, we're going to explain how you can connect lots of completely random pieces of information, like a deck of cards or a random string of numbers, very quickly and effectively to a physical space or location you already have memorized. But for now, let's think about several other powerful strategies for remembering the 20 markers or items on your grocery list. In one example, you can divide or chunk the list items into departments. Milk products, such as milk, cheese, and yogurt. Meat products, 3 sorts of sausage, chicken breast and steak, and so on. This would be like a tree data structure, similar to how mind maps work if you're familiar with those. You could then try to visualize the packages you get at each department. Since each package is below 7 items, you should be able to recall the visual image per department with great detail. As we mentioned, this is a lot like a memory palace, but you don't have to worry about all that just yet. Alternatively, since this list doesn't have a story or logical flow the way a text you read generally would, you could build your own story and visualize a sort of animation of your mother milking a cow and preparing cheese from the milk, and then throwing in some jam to make yogurt instead, since your niece has a sweet tooth. Imagine that your niece is missing 3 teeth, which makes it difficult for her to bite off a chunk of sausage. Then your niece laughs, calls your mother a chicken breast, runs away, and falls. At the end of the story, your mother puts a frozen steak on the bump on her head. Now, this is a completely ridiculous story, but it's so ridiculous that you're not likely to forget it anytime soon. Of course, in general, we hope that the information you read will be interesting enough that the original logical structure of the text will be sufficient to link your markers together. So you can imagine Ebenezer Howard looked like Ebenezer Scrooge and picture him designing his hub-and-spoke garden city on a piece of paper with a book by Henry George who looks like King Henry from The King's Speech on the cover, and that book is sitting on the table next to him. This is a specific chunk of markers which forms what we could call a compound marker. In another chunk, you can imagine him drawing out the diagram with blocks of 32,000 people by pretending he had a 32 gigabyte iPhone on the table with him, And essentially, you're using your existing logical markers and connections to chunk all the markers together exactly as they appear in the text. Amazing, isn't it? But what if the content isn't logical or connected or interesting enough, even in a written text? If, for example, you were memorizing all the bones in the wrist, they may not seem to have such logical and neat relationships between the markers that you might hope for. For convenience sake, let's imagine that everything we now know about garden cities is just a random series of facts. How could you package all of our different markers? Well, if we were forced to connect all of these existing markers without the logic of the text, we might get something like this. Ebenezer Scrooge and King Henry VIII riding in an overcrowded carriage with radial wheels through King George's Green Garden on the way to their 1902 World's Fair. Now that one image contains 7 markers from the last lecture, all chunked together in an easy-to-remember story. You see, all we have to remember is this one compound package of markers, and we remember 7 very specific details about the Garden City movement. Again, we do hope that you'll be able to use the logical markers and inherent connections between your markers to chunk them together into compound markers and link them into a logical flow. But, as you can see, any set of markers can be chunked and linked with enough creativity. Whichever way you do it, by linking these markers in a quick and dirty way into a vivid, memorable story or a set of chunked compound markers in the first example, you've been able to recall many more markers than you would if you had just made a simple list. Eventually, you should be able to use the different methods of remembering different kinds of information depending on how well it's logically connected in the text. As a rule, your list should be chunked at around 4 to 7 objects just to be on the safe side, but you can always have subchunks or details within the markers that contain 3 to 4 more pieces of information per marker, if the information is particularly dense. As an example of this, a submarker detail might be picturing Ebenezer Scrooge with a green belt, if we determined that that particular detail was relevant. Again, we'll go into more detail about this later, but keep in mind that almost every text we read is organized in a similar structure by the internal logic of the text. The text is divided into sections, a section is divided into paragraphs and chapters, paragraphs are divided into sentences, and so on. For this reason, it's important that you never try to memorize or link a marker outside of its context if you're using this hierarchical structure. The marker should be remembered within a package or a story interconnected to the other markers in a specific and logical area of the text. This is a bit overwhelming, I know, but bear with me. When you try to remember a list, you should visualize the first and the last item in the list in more detail than the other markers. I bet you already know why. That's right, because this will allow you to reverse engineer any details that you happen to forget. Furthermore, you'll be able to recreate the story both from the beginning and from the end. It's a good idea to practice doing this, actually. Don't spend too much time imagining your middle markers, as long as you have a unique mental animation to connect these markers to the markers before and after, like my image of Ebenezer Scrooge sketching with the book on his table. When you visualize such a package marker, the whole package appears as one marker, one compound marker, with each item within the package as a detail or a detail marker. So our overall marker, and you'll have to imagine this because there's no way I could find it on the stock image website, could be Ebenezer Howard's study where he worked on designing the Garden City, whereas a detail would be the book by Henry George on the table, the radial drawing on his desk, and an overcrowded and poor crowd outside his window or by the green belt on his waist. By the way, take note of that logical marker I've created by putting Henry George's book on the table. That logical marker actually shows that Ebenezer Howard was inspired by his work. Pretty cool, right? When making package markers, try to avoid inserting information that was not originally in the text, because these techniques are powerful and you'll likely remember that information as well. So it probably wasn't a great idea to add that carriage to my earlier example unless I'm sure that I won't forget that the radial wheels are actually what matters. We really want to make the recall process as simple and non-ambiguous as possible. It's important that you experiment with the different ways of chunking and packaging markers and different levels of ridiculous markers to determine what's a good fit for you. These tricks of linking and chunking markers will make huge improvements to your ability to retain the markers long term. However, for material that you need to memorize with near 100% efficiency, you can refer to the advanced lecture on memory palaces towards the end of the course.